So I'm going to be showing you how to replace the transmission. This is a 2008 Rav4. It's the 4-cylinder with the 2AZ FE, the 2.4 liter, and mine is the 4-wheel drive version. So the reason I'm making an intro to this video is because I ran into some weird things because mine is 4-wheel drive, and I wanted to share those with you. You should definitely watch this before you just start taking your transmission out, because I actually wouldn't have even had to take my transmission out. And by the way, if you've never replaced a transmission or an engine before, it's extremely easy to do with the 4-cylinder and the Rav4, because there's just so much room around the engine and the transmission. And I actually replaced the engine in the same car 2 weeks before the transmission broke. Crazy, especially since this only has about 2,010 miles on this. Anyway, what started to happen was it started to shift really rough, going from first to second and going from second to third. I want to say it was worse going from second to third. I can't remember. Can't be completely sure, but I think that was it. And it would only do it when the transmission got hot. When it was cold, it wouldn't really do it. And I took it to a transmission repair shop. He drove it a little bit. He was like, yeah, for sure, it's a bad solenoid. I'd see it in these transmissions. This is what happens with them. I showed it. I was talking about it to the place that I bought the transmission and the engine from for this, and he was like, yeah, if it's a problem going from second to third gear, it's the transmission. The transmission's bad. So anyway, mine just had a bad solenoid, and what you actually can do if your solenoid is bad is you can just take the whole valve body. The valve body is the thing that's right underneath where the oil pan is on the bottom of the transmission, and there's going to be this big filter, and then the valve body is right under that. You can't just replace one solenoid. You want to replace the whole valve body. And to see if the if the new valve body you put in doesn't work, you're going to have to reprogram the TCM, the transmission control module. But there's like a little number stamped on the bottom of the valve body, I think the guy showed me, and if those match up, you should, like with mine, we just swapped in the other valve body and it just worked. We didn't have to reprogram the TCM or anything like that. But the reason we ended up swapping over the valve body was because the 4-wheel drive transmissions for the 4-cylinder are extremely expensive. I think they're just very rare. You'll spend like $1,700 for one that has way over 100,000 miles. The prices are ridiculous for these. But what we were trying to do is I got the used transmission from this place. I definitely recommend these guys. I got the engine there too. They're located in San Leandro, California, which is pretty local for me, but I think it'd be worth getting them to ship stuff to you too. Their prices are good. They have the 2-wheel drive transmissions there for only $400. I got the engine for $1,200. The engine I got, it's a JDM one. It only had like 40,000 miles on it. He'll do compression tests right in front of you. The guy Gio that runs the place is amazing. I mean, they have 161 Google reviews and 4.5 stars. It's because of Gio, the guy that runs it. The guy is really awesome, super friendly, very knowledgeable, and stuff that he'll do for you is like when I got the new engine, it needed a new valve cover. You have to swap the valve cover over from my old engine onto that one. I did it myself, but he offered to do it for me for free if I just brought in the old engine. And what he was trying to do for me with this transmission, he was saying, because he only had 2-wheel drive transmissions, and he was saying that he could get that to work. They just swap over the parts with the extra, like the diff on it and everything, from the 4-wheel drive one over to the 2-wheel drive one. He'd done it a bunch of times before, but for some reason with my transmission, that wouldn't work. They were slightly different. They wouldn't line up right. I don't know if it was like the end of a split year or something. And he said he had probably done it like 15 times before. For some reason with mine, it just wouldn't work. Of course, I get that bad luck after the transmission breaking like 2 weeks after I replaced the entire engine. We figured out though, since it was just a bad solenoid and the prices for the 4-wheel drive transmissions were so outrageous, he just swapped over the valve body for me. And some easy internal stuff, he just swapped, like the oil pump he swapped out, and then he took like the filter, the transmission fluid filter from the newer transmission, the JDM one, and I took like the torque converter too, because that was easy. So the reason I'm telling you this is because what you can do, I wouldn't have even had to take the transmission out of the car to do this. I could just went underneath it and just replace the valve body. You don't want to replace just one solenoid. You want to replace the entire valve body. And if you can get one from a JDM engine or a JDM transmission, or a transmission with really low miles, like these JDM stuff, they usually, you know, they'll have like 60,000 miles or less, or, you know, something like that. They're all really low mileage. If you can get one like that and just swap it on, it's going to be way better than like a rebuilt one anyway, and cheaper. Like you can get these transmissions for $400, or, you know, probably $600 or $550 even shipped. Like if you wanted to order one from JDM Engine Bay or even another place, told them, you know, that all you really wanted was the valve body, and you could look at the little numbers stamped on the bottom of yours and see, you know, if they can get one that matches up with that. And you could probably tell them just to take the valve body out and just ship you that, and then you'd save a lot of money on the shipping costs if they're only shipping you that compared to a whole transmission. And probably they'd, you know, ship that to a residential address too. It's hard to get the engines and transmissions. A lot of times they won't ship to residential addresses, or they'll charge more. So I just want to let you know that little tip. You know, you can get around actually replacing the transmission, just swap the valve bodies over, and then you might have to get the TCM reprogrammed at like a transmission shop also, but you know, they'll probably charge you like $150 to do that. So I'm replacing the transmission on a 2008 Rav4. It's got the 4-cylinder, 2.4 liter, 4-wheel drive, bottom, and the battery tray and the air intake. And after that, there's just a bunch of bolts you gotta remove. You lift this thing back for the starter. Here's a 12mm bolt here. There's a wire thing that goes in here. There's a bolt down there for ground wire. This bolt here for this bracket holding on this. There's like a little plastic clip that goes into the this thing here on the dipstick. There's a bolt here holding in the dipstick. You just pull the dipstick out, and there's this going to the speed sensor, and these two parts of the wiring harness down here. And then there's two bolts here, two 12s holding on this bracket for the shift selector. You can just remove this 12mm bolt here, remove the shift selector off. There's two 12s here holding on the transmission cooler. There's one 12 back here holding on another bracket for the shift selector. And then there's just these two hoses down here. You can access them easier from the bottom. So you need a couple clamps. You just pop those off the transmission going from the transmission cooler. And that's pretty much everything you need to remove up here on the top part of the transmission. Drain the transmission fluid and the front diff fluid right here. I think they call it like the transfer case or something like that. I can't remember. So you gotta remove the axles on both sides. I haven't gotten the axles out yet, but I removed the wheels. Remove these bolts here. Remove the ABS sensor. And you remove the brakes. Obviously I got the brakes just tied up here to the suspension. And then you have to remove the whole subframe. So you remove these. Basically you just pop this off. There's going to be a cotter pin you have to pull out, and then I just put this bolt down so the top of the bolt was flush with that, whack it real hard with a hammer. So I actually had trouble getting these back on, and it's because if the bolt just doesn't thread on easily by hand, this will actually just spin. And I realized I messed up the very edge of the threads from hitting it with a hammer. But in order to fix that, I just took another bolt that it would spin onto, just took my impact and just spun it on and off a bunch of times just to clean up the threads, and now it'll go on there easier. I can get it on with the impact. And then I remove this down here. If yours is stuck, you do the same thing with a hammer. And then the axle here, when you remove this, the big bolt on here, it's a 30mm, it has to be a 12-point socket. You have to bang a punch in here to get the dent out. And if you don't have a strong impact driver, I'd recommend getting one just for this job. It's going to help a lot. And then back there, you're going to have to wedge a pry bar in between.
in between the back of the axle and the transmission case. I'm gonna finish taking the axles out after I move, because I need to remove the whole subframe. The transmission here, you gotta get all this out of the way, and this bar here from the subframe to drop the transmission out of the bottom. So right now I'm working on removing this whole subframe. There's a nut on the bottom of this. This holds the subframe to the steering column here. There's another one on this side. This rear engine mount here, transmission mount, it's really bolted to the transmission. There's going to be 2 nuts in here, and then 2 bolts right here. Remove those. And then to remove the subframe, there's only this one out of the 4 engine mounts that's connected to the subframe, but I put these jack stands under the transmission right here just to be safe. You could also support it from above, obviously. Yeah, if you do need to use a cheater bar, remember the best cheater bar is just take the handle off of your jack. I have a pretty small impact, so I need to use a cheater bar for that one bolt. I've got my floor jack under it with a big board, pretty much the perfect size actually. I'm just going to try to remove it all at one piece. I'm just going to leave this stuff on it. I'm going to remove this with it, I think. Or maybe not this one, but at least the one on the other side you have to pull the transmission down. And there's kind of just like a bunch of like 17, 19 millimeter bolts. Yeah, so there's this here, is that long bolt there, and then 2 nuts there. And then there's this bolt right here. Looks like rusty water coming out of it or something. And then I just remove these 2 bolts right here. And on this side you gotta remove this piece, these 2 long bolts. Right there, right here, 17 millimeter. Actually just using a ratchet on the top part here, but then I just realized that this hole is here, so you can just bring a ratchet down to the bottom, which will be easier, or just use an impact. And that's everything there. Is actually way easier than I thought it was going to be. I'd recommend removing these bolts first to hold the steering column on, because the one on the other side here is getting stuck. As you can see right there. And when you're lowering it, just lower it a little bit and then make sure nothing is sticking to it so you don't rip anything off the car. Before I drop this thing down, I'm just gonna go ahead and get all these bolts out of the way.
So she lost half of her power yesterday. Yeah. So I'm going
slowly let this sucker drop. I'm sure it's real heavy. Oop, slower. Double check, make sure there's nothing actually attached to it. Yeah, there's nothing else attached to it. Looks like the hubs or whatever the hell they're called touch down first.
Those lines, right?
And boom. Now I just gotta get it off the jack. And push it back a bit so it's out of the way of the transmission. Just like make sure to move the steering column over. I like to do with just whatever bolts I can, is just put them, just kind of rest them in the spot where they came out. And save them there for later, then you can't mix them up. I just tied up that steering rack a little bit to get out of the way a little. As you can see, there's like way more room to get the axles out now. Definitely recommend just dropping the subframe first. Passenger side one here is this mount here, and it should just be able to pull out of the mount. I think there's this bolt on the bottom, probably need to loosen that up, and then there's this like retaining clip here. You need to squeeze these with pliers and then bring that forward. It looks like yeah, it'll pop forward once you squeeze it enough. You could also just take the whole mount off. There's just 3 bolts, 2 on the bottom of it, and then 1 on the top. Or no, there's 1 on the bottom, sorry, right here. And there's 2 on the top. The 2 on the top you can get with a power tool, I think. 1 on the bottom's harder. Then you can just use a pry bar, like you can hit probably the edge here with like a block of wood and a hammer, and it should pop out of the diff. I can't really get this axle off at all, but I would recommend just disconnecting the mount here with those 3 bolts. what I'm gonna do is just take the piece of the exhaust off here. There's just a joint there and a joint here. I'm just gonna take that off, and then I'm just gonna take the transmission off with this axle on it. Worry about getting the axle off after I get the transmission out. So it's just all 14mm bolts. 2 of them on each joint. I just forgot to disconnect the wiring thing right there where the O2 sensor is connected. Yeah, I just realized since I took the axle out after I dropped the transmission and didn't take the mount off, you actually cannot get the axle back into the diff there with the mount on it. So now I need to take the mount off. So if you did it like me and just dropped the transmission, the axle is still in, it's still in the mount, I'd recommend putting the axle into that diff before you lift up the transmission to get it on there. Because when you lift it up, the mount, well, you can actually just spin it around, but I can't get it in there that way with that mount on it. So now I need to take the mount off. And yeah, the one on this side, now there's just a ton of room around it, where before you could only get a pry around this little hole here, and you just need to pry it away from this. This is like a shield here, so you probably want to pry along this here and not along this thin metal here, because you'll like already damaged it, as you can see right there. Then you gotta remove this engine mount. There's a nut and a bolt that go through the center. You pull that out. And then it looks like there's 3 mounting bolts that you can take the bracket off with. Or, I mean, you could also just leave the bracket on and then take it off after you drop the transmission too. Oh yeah, and don't forget to remove this 10mm bolt first to get that bracket off the mount. I'm gonna get the drive shaft out. Toyota actually calls it the propeller shaft, and then this the drive shaft, and the other one the axle, but you know, it's a drive shaft. Basically, you just remove these 4 bolts here. And let's see, can you spin it around to get it, all of them? I think maybe if I put it in neutral, I might be able to spin this around by hand. And then, so you just remove these 4. Remove those 2 bolts down there, holding that clamp, and then there'll be like a joint in the middle. It'll come down, and then you can just pull this end out. Yeah, you might as well take this mounting bracket off first. That goes right here. Give yourself a little more room to access these. Just 3 14mm. Putting it in neutral did not allow me to turn that. Not sure. There might be a way to get it to turn by hand. I set it up like this to 12mm on my impact, and I was able to just barely get that bolt on there and just zap them off. You can see where it separates. Mine didn't want to separate, so I just stuck a screwdriver in there and just hit it with a hammer until it popped loose. The owner's manual did say when taking off or storing it, not to let that, I think it said joint number 2, pretty sure that means the middle joint, not to let it exceed 20 degrees. So just to be safe and just propping it up so it's not, you know, at that sharp angle just sitting there all the time, because I don't know, it might damage it. You might want to take this end and just pull it over there so these don't hit the end of this when you're dropping it down. Next I'm going to go ahead and gonna remove this. I'm gonna basically just remove all the extra bolts that I need to do under this first. Now there's a bunch of bolts in here. You're gonna take it's a 17mm on the crank bolt, spin the engine clockwise until you remove all of these. And then mine has 4 bolts down here. I think the 2-wheel drive one might just have 3 bolts. So there's 4 down here. I'm going to remove those 2. When you're turning this around, you want to leave the bolt right on the edge there, because when you turn this, when you go to loosen that, this is going to turn that way, and then the ratchet's going to hit up against this, so it'll be stuck up against there. Some of the other bolts that belt the bell housing to the engine probably might be easier to reach from below too. There is, you can see one right here, and then there's another one right there. Another one that's easier to reach from the bottom is this one down here. You might want to wait till you get this mount out of the way first, it's up to you. And actually you can just zap that thing out. Use a real long extension, makes it a lot easier. Also one right down here, I believe. it's a 17 millimeter bolt. Should be able to zap that one out from the side, same as the other one. This one I was not able to zap out from the side like the other one. Makes the extension at too much of an angle. So now there's just two more on the top. One right here, and one it's back there under under this stuff. You'll see it. They're both the bigger 17 millimeter ones. And then it should just be able to get those two and then remove the front engine mount and then the driver's side one right here, and then I believe it should be free. So just make sure you have it all jacked up good with what you're going to lower it with before you take all those off. I decided to use my cherry picker, put a strap around that end of it, and then I'm going to take this top mount off here, put this bolt back in, and then put a chain around this part right here. And I'm going to take this whole mount off. It's 14 millimeter, and you've got to hold the nut on one side, and then there's 4 17 millimeters on both of these sides here. Just stick my jack under that side of the transmission, and then move these jack stands over to the engine. It's probably better to have it over on that side of the engine, lift it up, or it would be, since the only engine mount is over on the passenger side. But thing is, I think if I have the jacks here, it might kind of get away and trying to lower this down and put it on something. So put it over there for now. We'll see. You know, I've still got the jack and everything. Jack the transmission up just slightly, like an inch or two. If you jack it up the right height, this bolt here will just slide out really easy. And then setting up an extension like this will allow you to get to that without having to use a wrench. And if you're using the hoist like me, I didn't think this through, didn't make these long enough. Now when I'm lowering it, the arm is running into this right here. So if you run into that problem, you just need something to set the transmission down on, and then just redo your chains or straps on top or whatever, make them longer. Alright, now I got this set up. I can get those 2 bolts on the bell housing off, and then that other engine mount over there, and then I think it should be free. One back there you can reach with a ratchet and a pretty decent extension. The one that is right, where is it? Right here, you basically just have to get with a wrench. Front engine mount, there's 2 17 millimeters here holding it to the radiator support. And a 19 millimeter right there going through the center of the mount. Mount up and over the side, and then pull it down. Pull it down right here, and then the nut on the end of this one actually holds in place. You don't need a wrench, which is nice. And then it looks like there's 3 14 millimeters holding that bracket on there. Just gonna need to get that bracket off, and then after that should be able to drop the transmission down. So yeah, the bolt on top is easiest to go from the top of the car. And then these 2 I did from the bottom. This one is a freaking bitch to get out because you have no room. I used this with just the short socket on it, and then also used, where is it? I also used this 14 millimeter ratcheting wrench, and then I had to put the pipes on it as a cheater bar to pop them loose. They're pretty tight. One trick you can do that made it a lot easier to take that bracket out is you could push the whole engine and transmission towards the back of the car and hold it there to give yourself more room to stick your tools up there in your hand. You can see the engine and transmission are already separated on the bottom there, but top is still together. There's 2 dowel pins. There's one around here and then one kind of back there, sort of on top, that go into the engine and transmission, and they're about maybe a centimeter or so. You have to get them separated before it'll break free of those dowel pins. What you can do is put like some pry bars in there and just keep banging with a hammer bigger and bigger pry bars in between there until they get completely separated. I decided to put the jack under the engine actually so I could raise and lower it. Might make it. So what I do is raise the engine up a tiny bit there, lowered this way down, and actually all I did was hammer this in right there, and it just popped loose like super easy. And as you're lowering it, you just want to lower it really slow and just keep double checking that, you know, nothing's snagging it up and that you actually got everything off of it. You look out for all these, like the wiring harness, the coolant hoses, the bracket over there. And with that axle, it's still attached to it. The mount on it should just kind of pivot and spin up as you lower it. That's what happened when I pulled the engine out of the top of it. So that thing shouldn't be anything to worry about, but you know, check that too. Just double check everything. Lower it really slowly. Here we go. I had this little cradle I made for the engine before. I put it on a skateboard. Obviously, like a dolly would be more ideal, but you know, this will work. And then to keep it from tipping over, just put a 2x4 on one side of it. I'm gonna see if I can get this fucking axle out. Now it's coming out pretty easy. I'm sticking a piece of wood and just smacking it with a hammer. It's almost out, I think. And then just remember the torque converter can fall out. Mine was falling out. I was hitting it with a hammer, and a bunch of fluid will drip everywhere. I mean, it's not a big deal if you're replacing it. I don't know if it'll hurt it if it falls, but there's probably one reason why it's hard to get out. This one is just like a lot of it is inside of that diff, but definitely just easier to get it off after you drop the transmission. I think it takes like 2 seconds to take off that piece of the exhaust. So as you can see now, I was surprised this whole piece here goes into that diff, because I guess this isn't really attached to the diff at all, because the diff I think probably controls the front to back wheels with the 4-wheel drive. So when you're taking out, a lot of it has to come out before you get this thing out of there. So just some quick tips for when you're putting it back together. I had a really hard time lining up the transmission with the engine. You just kind of have to mess around with it, just kind of get it to line up right, watch, see if it's catching on stuff. It took me a while, but you might get more lucky. Probably help if you have 2 jacks too. You could like jack the engine, jack the transmission. It's kind of hard to get can be hard to get the transmission like straight, but as long as you just get it lined up, or you can get 1 bolt in, just search for a spot where you can get 1 of these bell housing bolts in, tighten that up a bit. If you can get 1 in, you're pretty much good. And some stuff I'd recommend doing before you put the subframe back on. I'm gonna go ahead and fill this back up before I put the subframe back on, and then put the axles on before I fill this up, so the fluid just doesn't fall out. It takes a half a liter, like half a quart. And also going to make sure I bolt on the axle mount before I put the subframe on. That should be easier to do that first also. Oh yeah, and there's a bolt that goes into right here on that mounting bracket, and then this clip right here, you gotta squeeze it with a pair of pliers and then just pop it out that way. And now I can just mount this on the engine first and then slide the axle in. Now if you do need to remove this, mine actually wasn't too hard, but it gets rusty in there, as you can see. Squirted a bunch of WD-40 in, and then I just whacked these ends of the bracket here really hard with a hammer, and it came off. It actually wasn't too hard, it just took a minute or two, but yours could be much harder. I would just recommend just mounting it or just putting this in the transmission first and then just raising it that way. And then when you install it back, I'd recommend, so it's easier to get out next time, you can just take some anti-seize and just coat the inside of this, and then that should keep the rust from sticking it together next time. And then also, if it's really hard to get out, you could heat this up with a blowtorch first too. That should make it a lot easier. Easiest way to put oil into the diff is just get like a hose that fits in there, bring it up to the top, and then put a funnel in the hose. And I actually forgot to put this exhaust thing on first. It's probably slightly easier to put it on before the subframe, but I don't think it's a big deal. So when you put the subframe on, if you just get one person to help you, it's really easy. I put this engine, the rear engine mount, and the bracket on the motor first. So I put the bracket on and then just put the mount on it before I put the subframe on. Then basically you just kind of jack it up. If you have one other person help you balance it. And then I just got these 2 bolts in by hand first. And just get all the bolts in by hand, you know, before you start tightening down all the way. Basically you just have, there's these things go like this, and the long bolt is there. These are 2 short bolts and the long ones. I had to push this part forward to get these to line up, so just leave everything loose first. And there's these 2 bolts here, and then 2 nuts for the engine mount. And there's these long ones with a nut on the bottom that connect the steering rack to the subframe. Still need to tighten those. And yeah, that's pretty much it right there. It's super easy if you have somebody helping you.